Vitamins. This can be a very short lecture because I could tell you that vitamins are nutrients needed in small amounts to prevent deficiency diseases, and that a balanced diet contains all the vitamins in required amounts. And these vitamins, there's just 13 of them. There's the fat-soluble A, D, E, and K, and the water-soluble ones. But that would be a very short lecture. The fact is that there's a lot of detail with vitamins and a lot of interesting history. So let's get started. We go back to France and a French physiologist by the name of François Magendie, way back in the 18th century and early 19th century. And he was intrigued with food. And he did some simple experiments. He took a dog and he fed the dog nothing but sugar, and the dog did not do very well. It expired on the 32nd day of this experiment. Well, he wondered what was going on here. Is there any single food that can actually sustain life? The single food that they thought about in those days was, believe it or not, bone broth. Why? Because it was cheap, it was readily available, you can just cook up bones, and the idea was to find something to feed to people who were not very well nourished, who were very, very poor. So they looked at bone broth. Today we know what is really in there. It's gelatin that leaches out of the bones. And they set up a so-called gelatin commission. And they were to investigate whether or not this food would sustain life. Well, it turned out it did not. That doesn't mean that bone broth lost all its popularity. In fact, it's still popular today. There are people who believe that this is the next best thing, in terms of nutrition, and that we got to go out and buy bone broth. There's a place in New York called Brodo's, and it's a fascinating establishment. They sell various versions of bone broth, and people line up around the block to get this thing. And what does it look like? It kind of looks like a clear consommé. But this would not sustain life. It doesn't mean that there's something wrong with it, of course not, in the overall context of a diet. But it is, in fact, very low in vitamins. That's the reason that it did not sustain life back in Magendie's day, when all they gave to animals, or even tried it on people, was bone broth. Well, that opens up the book for us to the story of vitamins. And it's a very interesting story, and it really starts with a disease with the fascinating name of beriberi. And that comes from a language that is used in Sri Lanka, formerly Ceylon. And it translates roughly to, I cannot. And the picture, of course, tells the tale. These people are virtually crippled. They just can't do anything. Well, this disease interested Dr. Christian Eijkman, a Dutch physician. And this was at a time when germs were being talked about. I mean, Louis Pasteur had already voiced his ideas about diseases being transmitted by what he called germs. And Eijkman thought that maybe this disease, beriberi, also was born by germs. That is, it could be transmitted. Well, there was one simple way to try this, and that was to take some blood from someone who was suffering from this disease, beriberi, and inject it into chickens to see whether or not they would also get the disease. Well, they did inject it into chickens, and nothing happened. But it's a good thing that this physician worked with chickens, because one day he noticed that his chickens were getting very, very sick. And they were showing signs of what looked to him like beriberi, even though he had not done anything to these chickens, and certainly was not the injections that had done this. That was long past. Well, it turned out that these chickens actually recovered from the disease that looked like beriberi. How did that happen? When their diet changed. Because it turned out that the cook who was responsible for feeding the animals decided that he was not going to give military rice to civilian chickens. Well, the military rice was the nice polished white rice, and he switched the chickens to a diet of brown rice. Well, it turned out that chickens that had been fed the polished rice developed beriberi, and the chickens that were fed the whole grain rice recovered from this. Well, this was a fascinating discovery. But Eichmann, as clever as he was, incorrectly interpreted this information. And he thought that it was something in the polished rice that carried a toxin, and something in the bran somehow neutralized that toxin. Well, that was not the case. And he eventually became convinced of this by another researcher who showed quite clearly that beriberi was caused by a nutritional deficiency, not some sort of toxin. And then it all started to make sense, because it was well known that the diet in people who suffered from beriberi was mostly based on polished rice. And there were some very interesting observations. In Java, for example, only 1 out of 10,000 prisoners in Java developed beriberi in the prisons that served mostly brown rice, whereas the disease was quite common in areas and prisons where it was white rice. That was the staple of the diet. So things began to look pretty interesting. It was very obvious that there was something that was present in brown rice that prevented this disease from manifesting itself. But it took a while until it was discovered that this was a specific compound, which we now know as vitamin B1. Much of that research was done in England, actually, by Frederick Gowland Hopkins, because he was the one to show that even if you had a diet that had all of the nutrients, which at that time were thought to be essential, the proteins, the carbohydrates, the fats, the minerals, and this still was incapable of supporting growth. And he said that there must be some accessory food factors that were required. Well, the two of these two researchers, Gowland Hopkins and Eichmann, received the Nobel Prize for the discovery. That discovery, of course, was the discovery of what we now know as vitamin B1, although they did not know its molecular structure at that time. They just knew that this substance could be isolated from certain foods, and it could be used to reverse beriberi. It was Casimir Funk, a Polish biochemist, who actually found the answer to this mystery. And it was he who also coined the word vitamin. He isolated the anti-beriberi factor from brown rice, and chemically speaking, he found it to be an amine. And because this was such a wonderful thing to reverse beriberi, he said it was a vital amine. And thus was born the term vitamin. And he, of course, also postulated that there were other diseases that were due to deficiencies in certain substances that are present in food. He knew, even when he coined the term vitamin, he actually knew that some of these other substances were likely not amines in chemical terminology, but he thought that it was a very catchy name, that is vital amine. And this vital amine that he isolated, today we know as vitamin B1 or thiamine. And its chemical structure was eventually determined in the 1930s, and it was subsequently synthesized, and today it is quite readily available.